July 9, 1944. Camp Shanks, New York. The truck stopped at 4:20 p.m. brakes, hissing engines, shaking the dust loose from the pine boards of the intake yard. 78 German women stepped down one by one, wrists trembling, eyes narrowed against the sun. None of them had been told why they were here. None of them had been told what would happen next. The only words they heard were short commands from guards who did not speak their language. Line up. Face forward. Do not talk. The air smelled of diesel and hot gravel. A chain-link fence rattled in the wind. And then the order came. Prepare for full inspection. 3 words delivered by a sergeant through a translator. Flat and cold, but heavy enough to pull every drop of blood from their faces. Full inspection meant only one thing to them: undress, exposure, shame. In Europe, they had seen what happened when women fell into enemy hands. They had heard what German units had done to captured Soviet nurses in 1941. They had seen what Japanese officers did to women during field interrogations. None of those stories ended with mercy. All of those stories ended with humiliation. Within seconds, the tension spread like static across the group. A young woman named Lysel pressed her elbows tight to her rib cage. Another whispered a prayer under her breath. A third bit her knuckle until it bled. The guard said nothing more. No explanation, no reassurance, just the same stillness, the same rifle slung across chests, the same silence that felt like a verdict. The sun dropped lower, throwing long shadows across the yard like black bars on a cell floor. A truck door slammed behind them, and several women jolted as if struck. Their imaginations filled every gap the Americans refused to fill. They pictured cameras, harsh lamps, a room full of male soldiers. They pictured being lined up, ordered to strip, examined in ways that left no dignity. They braced for it. They accepted it. They thought it would begin at any moment, and they believed nothing could stop it. If you believe the women truly expected humiliation in the next few minutes, comment 1. If you disagree, hit like and subscribe to hear the next chapter of this forgotten history. Fear settled over them like a weight they could not shift. It pressed into their ribs, tightened, their throats, burned behind their eyes. The moment the translator repeated the phrase full inspection, every woman in that yard understood a single truth. What came next would not be kind. It would not be gentle. It would not be dignified. Their minds reached backward through 3 years of war and pulled every memory of what armies did to women when discipline collapsed. They had seen barns in Belarus where Soviet captives were stripped for lice checks while guards laughed. They had heard rumors from Italy where female partisans were paraded half-naked as warnings. They had watched German officers order body searches on Polish workers without privacy. None of those images could be separated from the order they had just heard. Fear did not climb slowly. It arrived fully formed, immediate, absolute. At 4:32 p.m., a corporal moved down the line holding a clipboard. He checked each face, marked a number, kept walking. The women thought he was cataloging them for public exposure, the kind used to break morale. A 41-year-old seamstress named Martyr closed her eyes and forced her breathing into short, controlled bursts. She had survived bombings in Hamburg, starvation, rations, the death of her husband. But she had no defense against this. None of them did. The silence made it worse. Silence magnified everything. Silence became the enemy. A teenager named Ruth whispered to the woman beside her that the Americans might shave their heads next. She'd seen German officers shave the heads of French collaborators, a mark of shame, a warning. She imagined clumps of her blonde hair falling at her feet. She imagined being marched through this camp, baldled, stared at by male prisoners or guards. The thought made her knees weaken. She forced herself to stand straighter. Another woman, Anna, remembered the stories told in her village about what happened to captured nurses on the Eastern Front. Those stories were never told in full sentences. Only fragments, voices dropping to whispers. Entire rooms going quiet. She had seen photographs of Soviet women stripped to their slips in makeshift interrogation sheds. She assumed Americans would be no different, that every army behaved the same when given absolute power. The translator did nothing to calm them. He stood still, hands behind his back, eyes unreadable. He had spoken only the required words, nothing more. Nothing to soften what they heard. Nothing to challenge the nightmares already building in their minds. His expression became another confirmation that something terrible was minutes away. The guards tightened the formation. No one spoke. No one explained. It was procedure for the Americans, but the absence of explanation looked like preparation. A dozen women considered bolting for the fence. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Guards with rifles stood at each corner. Any attempt would only make things worse. At 4:41 p.m., a metal cart rattled across the yard carrying folded cotton gowns. White, thin, equal, the type worn in hospitals during examinations. The women stared at the stack as if it were a stack of knives. For them, the meaning was unmistakable. Those gowns were not meant to cover. They were meant to expose. Several women began shaking violently, enough that the guards took notice. But they said nothing, not a word. They continued with their tasks. They lifted the gowns, counted them, set them aside. No one offered the basic courtesy of telling the women why they were needed, or how the inspection would be conducted. It confirmed every fear. The women had rehearsed in silence. A gust of wind pushed dust across their bare ankles. The sun slid deeper and shadows grew longer, stretching like dark fingers across the ground. A woman in her 30s muttered that she would rather be shot than stripped in front of men. She meant it. Her voice held no tremor, no hesitation. Another woman pressed her palms together so tightly her knuckles went white. She prayed without words, the kind of prayer used by people who believe they no longer have control of their lives. Inside their heads, the scene played out in horrifying detail. A room filled with harsh overhead lamps. Dozens of male soldiers watching them. Commands barked. Clothes thrown into piles. Fingers poking, prodding, lifting. Questions asked with no translation. Laughter. Shame. That was what they expected. That was what they braced for. And because no one corrected them, their fear escalated fast, sharp, electric. Their assumptions were fueled by everything the war had taught them. That mercy was rare. That power made men cruel. That humiliation was a weapon. They had seen prisoners of every nationality treated like objects. They believed they were next. They believed the Americans would treat them the way armies treated women everywhere. When rank dissolved into desire or anger or boredom, war had stripped them of the ability to hope for anything else. At 4:54 p.m., the women were ordered to remove shoes and step forward 3 paces. The ground was hot enough to sting their feet. Several stumbled. One nearly fainted. The guards steadied her, but did not change their expression. Procedure continued as if none of the women were human, as if they were items being processed in a warehouse. That cold efficiency terrified them more than shouting would have. Shouting at least meant emotion. Emotion could be unpredictable, but silence meant intention. Silence meant this was routine, rehearsed, expected. A middle-aged woman named Hilda whispered bitterly that this was punishment for following orders in Germany. Another muttered that Americans wanted to break them the way Germany broke captured partisans. It did not matter whether the comparisons were fair. Fear does not rely on fairness. Fear takes the worst memories a person has and amplifies them until they seem inevitable. If you believe these women had every reason to expect humiliation based on what they had seen in the war, comment fear. If you disagree, tap, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. At 4:59 p.m., the metal door of the intake building creaked open, slow at first, then wide. Every woman in the yard stiffened as if a single electric pulse had run through all 78 bodies at once. They expected male guards. They expected hard faces, rough commands, hands pulling them into a room where dignity would be stripped away alongside their clothing. They braced for it, jaws, tight shoulders, rigid breaths, short and uneven. But what stepped into the doorway did not match anything their imaginations had prepared them for. 12 women in crisp Army Nurse Corps uniforms walked out in formation. White caps, polished shoes, identification tags gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Their movements were precise, practice, discipline. The sight hit the German prisoners like a jolt. For a moment, none of them processed what they were seeing. They had been ready to surrender their bodies to humiliation, not to women in pressed uniforms, carrying clipboards and stethoscopes. One of the nurses stepped forward. Her name was Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes, 31 years old, trained in New Jersey, fluent in German from her childhood. She lifted her chin, scanned the terrified faces in front of her, and spoke clearly. No shouting, no threats, no cruelty, only a calm voice shaped by years of caring for wounded soldiers. You are safe. No man will examine you. Every procedure will be done by us, and only us. The translator repeated her words, but half the prisoners had already understood. They heard safety before they heard language. The reaction was not relief. Not yet. Terror does not vanish in an instant. It melts. Several women blinked rapidly, confused. A few glanced at the nurse's hands, seeing no restraints, no batons, no instruments of shame. Instead, there were thermometers, medical forms, and neatly folded cotton gloves. A quiet shock rippled through the line. It was not the shock of violence, but the shock of a world turned upside down. Nothing in German propaganda had prepared them for American women stepping forward to protect their dignity. Lieutenant Hayes moved closer, stopping a few feet from the nearest prisoner. She softened her voice. Breathe. No one will harm you here. Then she switched to German. We are here to ensure you are healthy. That is all. A 20-year-old prisoner named Ruth stared at her as if at a hallucination. Her lips formed a single word. Why? Hayes understood but did not answer. There was no answer simple enough for a moment like this. Behind her, another nurse lifted a stack of white gowns the prisoners had mistaken for tools of humiliation. She held them like ordinary garments, not symbolic weapons. She explained that they were clean examination smock standard issue, meant to prevent infection. Infection, not punishment, not degradation. The translator repeated the explanation, and several prisoners exchanged stunned glances. They had prepared themselves for pain, not hygiene. At WW2 PM, one nurse knelt in front of an older woman named Marta, who was trembling so violently her teeth clicked. The nurse did not touch her at first. She placed a hand on her own chest, a gesture meant to signal calm, then gently reached forward and buttoned Marta's collar, which had come loose as she shook. The touch was delicate, hesitant, respectful. Marta's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. She had been bracing for rough hands. Instead, she felt something she had not felt since before the war: gentleness. A guard opened a medical logbook and handed it to Lieutenant Hayes. She began calling numbers, not barking them like a drill instructor, but reading them with the tone of someone reviewing a patient list. The prisoners stepped forward one by one, not because they were driven by force, but because confusion had briefly replaced terror. They did not understand this kind of power that restrained itself, power that held back instead of striking. Inside the building, overhead lights hung. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled cotton. Medical crates lined the walls. Fresh linens were stacked on metal shelves. 2 X-ray units stood ready, borrowed from a stateside hospital after the army decided the intake center required better equipment for large numbers of women. Everything was industrial, efficient, almost excessive. To the German prisoners, it felt unreal. They had expected a chamber of shame. They had stepped into a clinic. One nurse escorted 3 prisoners inside, speaking softly in German as she explained each step: temperature check, pulse, examination for wounds or infection. No unnecessary contact. No male personnel allowed. These were not the rules of an army of vengeance. These were the rules of a system built on procedures, regulations, and a level of medical abundance the prisoners had never witnessed. 2 women began to cry, not from pain, but from something even harder to process: the collapse of a fear that had seemed unbreakable moments earlier. Every humiliation they had seen across Europe had taught them one thing: this day would end in degradation. Yet nothing in this room matched that expectation. A German nurse among the prisoners whispered to her companion that she had never seen so many sterile supplies in one place, not even during hospital rotations in Hamburg. The idea that an enemy nation could spare this much care for prisoners was beyond comprehension. At 5:13 p.m., Lieutenant Hayes stepped back outside to address the remaining women. Her voice remained steady. You will be examined only for health. You will stay clothed until you are in private rooms. No man will be present at any point. Her tone did not waver, not once. She delivered the speech the way Americans delivered everything in this war, with structure, discipline, and a confident ease born of overwhelming resources. Many prisoners lowered their heads, not in submission, in disbelief. They had survived years of brutality. They had braced for the worst, but the worst never came. Instead, 12 American nurses had walked into the yard and dismantled every nightmare in seconds. If you believe the appearance of the 12 nurses changed everything the PS thought would happen, comment too. If you disagree, tap, like, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this history. At 5:17 p.m., the intake room doors closed behind the first group, sealing them in a world that none of them believed could exist in wartime. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bright but not harsh, casting clean white rectangles across the tile floor. A metal table stood against the back wall with rows of instruments laid out in perfect order. Thermometers and disinfectant cups, blood pressure cuffs coiled neatly, stethoscopes arranged like assembly line components. Nothing about the room suggested punishment. Every detail suggested procedure, and that was exactly what unsettled the German women most. They expected chaos. They found a system. Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes took the first clipboard and motioned for the 3 women to step forward. Her voice remained controlled, steady, almost gentle. She had completed more than 900 medical intakes since 1942. To her, this was routine. To the women standing in front of her, this was unimaginable. She instructed them to keep their smocks tied until instructed otherwise. She pointed to the screen dividing the room. Privacy screens. Another shock. Privacy was a luxury none of them associated with captivity. Yet here it stood, tall and canvas-backed, protecting them from the eyes of anyone else in the room. At 5:19 p.m., Nurse Carol, 28 years old, stationed at Fort Deans before her assignment here, stepped behind the screen with the first prisoner. Her instructions were crisper. Arms forward, temperature check, pulse measurement, inspection for wounds. She never raised her voice. She never touched more than necessary, and she narrated every movement as she made it. I am lifting your sleeve. I'm checking for infection. I am placing the stethoscope on your back. The woman under her care, Hilda, stared ahead with rigid shoulders, expecting at any moment the abrupt change from care to violation. It never came. The equipment told its own story. 2 X-ray machines pulled from a Newark hospital. A stainless steel sterilizer delivered by rail the previous week. A crate containing 400 pairs of sterile gloves. Another marked with 3,000 cotton swabs. A third packed with enough penicillin to treat an entire battalion. This was more than hygiene. This was infrastructure. This was the reach of an industrial machine so vast that even prisoners were processed with higher standards of care than wounded German soldiers had received in field hospitals in 43. The women saw that. They felt it. At 5:24 p.m., the second prisoner stepped behind the screen. She feared the stethoscope, flinching as the cold metal touched her skin. Carol paused, warmed it with her hands, then continued. The prisoner looked at her, startled. No German medic had ever paused to warm an instrument. Heat was wasted time. Gentleness was weakness. But here it was standard procedure. Hayes took notes, recording every detail with methodical precision. Heart rate, respiratory quality, scar locations, evidence of malnutrition. Only once did she ask a personal question. Do you have pain anywhere? It was not an interrogation. It was a medical question. At 5:27 p.m., the intake doctor, Captain Richard Hollis, entered the room. He was the only male staff allowed inside, and even he did not come within 5 feet of the prisoners. Regulations required it. Female PS could only be physically examined by women unless a life-threatening condition existed. Hollis stood behind the nurses, reviewing charts, approving treatment notes. He never crossed the privacy line. He never looked around the screen. He behaved like a surgeon in a controlled environment, not a captor in a war. To the German women, this distance, this self-restraint, felt more alien than cruelty. At 5:29 p.m., A nurse opened a cabinet filled with cotton gowns. Clean, white, identical. She handed them to the next group waiting in line. The gown smelled faintly of detergent, not sweat and soil. The contrast struck the women hard. In their military units, supplies were rationed, reused, stripped from the wounded or dead. Here, the United States Army had warehouses full of fresh garments reserved for people who were not even their own citizens. The women stared at the stacks, overwhelmed by what they represented. Excess, control, abundance. The next step was the dermatological check. Nurse Peterson, 34, skilled in battlefield triage, inspected skin for lice or infection. She did not rush. She did not snap orders. She adjusted the lighting to reduce discomfort. Another gesture. No pee expected. Her movements were clinical, detached from emotion. But the detachment was not cruelty. It was professionalism. The German prisoners interpreted professionalism as mercy because it left no room for humiliation. At 5:34 p.m., one prisoner broke down mid-exam. Her name was Clara, 23, captured near Cherbourg. She folded her arms around herself and whispered that she could not breathe. Hay stepped behind the screen, dismissed the others temporarily, and spoke in slow German. "You are safe. We are following procedure. Nothing more, nothing less." The phrase landed strangely in Clara's mind. Procedure was supposed to be terrifying. Procedure was supposed to be the machinery of cruelty. But here, procedure felt like structure, like protection, like a wall preventing the worst of human impulses. She steadied her breathing. At 5:38 p.m., the X-ray room opened. Two nurses escorted the next pair inside. The machine hummed loudly, a sound the women had heard only in urban hospitals before the war. Not field clinics, not aid stations, real infrastructure. Hayes explained that chest films were required for tuberculosis screening. The German women thought of the overcrowded shelters in Hamburg where they had lived for months. The Americans screened them, not to judge them, not to shame them, but to prevent disease inside the camp. Disease control, not dominance. Order, not fear. By 5:43 p.m., the intake line moved steadily. No shouting, no pushing, no invasive searches, nothing that resembled the terror they had braced for in the yard. The nurses documented everything on forms printed in quantities large enough to run a small hospital. Another sign of the vast industrial engine behind this war effort. Standardized paperwork printed at scale, distributed across dozens of camps. At 5:47 p.m., Hay stepped outside to bring in the next group. She paused. The women waiting on the gravel still held their smocks tight, still trembling, still imagining the same nightmare. They did not yet know that nightmare had already been dismantled inside the building. They did not yet know the system in front of them was not designed for punishment, but for management, for efficiency, for health. They would learn it piece by piece in moments that contradicted everything they believed about the enemy. By 5:50 p.m., the cycle repeated. Privacy, medical precision, gentle instruction, clinical distance, a level of care reserved for citizens in most countries. But here it was given to prisoners, not because the Americans loved them, not because they pitied them, but because the United States, with its deep reservoirs of resources, could afford to extend order and mercy even to its enemies. If you believe this medical procedure showed the power of abundance more than the power of force, comment mercy. If you disagree, tap like and subscribe to continue the story. At 5:52 p.m., the first examined prisoners were escorted out a rear doorway, not back into the yard, but into a narrow corridor leading toward the barrack sector. They walked slowly, still gripping the sides of their gown, still expecting some final twist of cruelty. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, bright and warm, and the air smelled faintly of soap, cotton, and heated metal. They had never walked through a military building that smelled clean. Clean meant maintenance. Maintenance meant excess manpower and excess supplies. Two things Germany no longer possessed. By mid-1944, the corridor opened into a processing wing where stacks of folded garments reached almost to the ceiling. Winter coats in olive drab, cotton undergarments, wool socks packed in bundles of 12. Every piece was labeled, categorized, arranged with the logic of a supply chain capable of outfitting thousands. A logistics sergeant handed each woman a clothing bundle that weighed nearly 10 lb. New, not recycled, not torn from the dead. New. A Quarterm's manifest pinned to the wall listed the inventory: 6,000 cotton blouses, 4,000 wool skirts, 5,000 pairs of undergarments, 1,000 winter overcoats. Numbers that would have outfitted an entire German division. Here they were allocated to prisoners. At 5:56 p.m., a corporal guided the women toward their assigned barracks. The building loomed ahead, whitewashed, insulated, fitted with storm windows. Inside, rows of bunks stretched wall to wall, each with a mattress thick enough to swallow a hand if pressed into it. Not straw, not canvas, cotton batting, the same type used in army training bases for American recruits. The German women froze at the entrance. They had slept in cellars, dugouts, agricultural barns, or on wooden planks through the worst years of the war. A warm mattress felt like a hallucination. It felt wrong. It felt impossible. The corporal pointed to a rack of blankets stacked 6 feet high. Camp Shanks had received a shipment of 60,000 blankets earlier that summer, enough to cover every bed from New York to Virginia. The women touched the fabric, hesitating as if expecting it to vanish. It did not. It was thick, soft, heavy enough to trap heat even in midwinter. A few prisoners exchanged looks of disbelief. One whispered that officers back home had never been issued bedding this clean. At 6:02 p.m., they entered the washroom. The space had 12 porcelain sinks, each with running water, hot water, and mirrors that were not cracked or clouded. Soap in militarische bars, white towels stacked in piles. A row of metal lockers smelled faintly of disinfectant and cedar. One woman, Anna, gasped when she saw steam rising from the shower stalls. Hot showers, not buckets of cold water. Not washing in snowmelt, steam, heat, infrastructure that required boilers, fuel, maintenance crews, spare parts, none of which Germany had in surplus by the stage of the war. At 6:07 p.m., a private distributed hygiene kits, toothbrush, tooth powder, comb, sanitary pads, cotton swabs, razor ointment. The kits came from Red Cross bulk shipments stamped on the crate Chicago 12 tons. The women stared as though they were being handed contraband. In Hamburg, mothers bartered jewelry for a single bar of soap. In Cherbourg, wounded soldiers tore their shirts into strips for bandages. Here, prisoners received more hygiene supplies in a single evening than many German families had seen in a year. At 6:12 p.m., they were escorted to the canteen. A bell rang as the door opened, revealing shelves filled with goods that should not have existed during a global war. Writing paper, envelopes, pencils, combs, stationery kits, buttons, thread, hard candies, even small tins of cold cream. And on the far right shelf, stacked in open crates, bottles of Coca-Cola imported from a statewide supplier in New Jersey, 200 bottles delivered weekly. The carbonation hissed as a guard opened one to demonstrate. Several women stared as if witnessing sorcery. A drink kept cold in wartime required ice shipments, refrigeration units, generators. Germany scarcely had working power grids left. At 6:18 p.m., the first prisoner purchased a bottle using her work credits. 8 cents earned from laundry sorting. 8 cents. She held the cold glass like an artifact recovered from another world. When she took her first sip, the carbonation stung her tongue, and she nearly dropped it in shock. She had expected bitterness. She found sweetness. She had expected humiliation. She found small comforts arranged as if she were a guest and not an enemy. At 6:21 p.m., the women moved to the dining hall. A dinner line stretched past steam tables. Metal trays clattered against rails. The air smelled of potatoes, carrots, stew, bread warm enough to steam when broken open. The food was simple but consistent. Calories measured, rations, balanced, protein counted. The cook served portions large enough to satisfy manual laborers. Germany's rations had shrunk by half since 1943. The women knew hunger intimately. Here, portions were generous, scientific, abundant. At 6:27 p.m., a nurse checked on them again, asking each if they felt ill, dizzy, dehydrated. No interrogation, no probing questions about units, commanders, or operations. Everything followed structure. Everything followed Geneva Convention rules with clinical precision. The women did not understand how an army could afford to treat its enemies with this level of order. They had been told America was decadent, sloppy, self-indulgent. But decadence was not what they saw. They saw capacity, production, systems built so efficiently that even prisoners were fed on schedules tighter than civilian food distribution in Germany. At 6:32 p.m., they returned to the barracks carrying blankets, hygiene kits, clothing bundles, and trays filled with leftover bread. The sun dipped behind the trees, flooding the compound with amber light. The barrack heaters clicked on automatically. The hum of machinery filled the silence. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling. Everything they had feared only 2 hours earlier. Humiliation, exposure, punishment had been replaced with the reality they could not process. Mercy wrapped in procedure, dignity wrapped in abundance. When one woman whispered, "How can a country at war spare this much for its prisoners?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke, but the truth was visible in every corner of the room. America won not by taking, but by producing. Not by scarcity, but by excess. Not by terror, but by systems that ran so smoothly, there was no room for cruelty to slip through the cracks. If you believe abundance can break fear more effectively than force, comment 3. If you disagree, tap like and subscribe to follow the next chapter of this story. At 6:38 p.m., the lights dimmed slightly as the barrack settled into evening routine. Not darkness, just a softer glow, warm enough to see clearly, gentle enough to signal rest. The women lay on their bunks, stiff at first, refusing to relax their muscles, every instinct telling them that comfort was a trap. Comfort in wartime usually preceded cruelty. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the punishment hidden behind this impossible softness. But the minutes passed, steady and uneventful, and the softness did not disappear. It stayed. That was the moment fear began to crack. Hilda was the first to sit upright, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. She looked across the aisle and whispered, "Why?" It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't awe. It was confusion so deep it destabilized her. All her life she'd been taught that enemies were predictable, violent, eager to break the defenseless. But none of that had happened here. In the past 2 hours, she had been treated with more courtesy than she'd received in her final months in Germany. A nurse warmed a stethoscope before touching her. Another tied her collar. A third explained every step of the exam. These gestures, small, unremarkable to Americans, landed like emotional shocks. At 6:42 p.m., Martyr struggled to remove her new boots. They didn't quite fit, and she cursed under her breath until a nurse returned, knelt in front of her, and swapped them for a better pair. No questions, no irritation, just a problem solved with quiet efficiency. Martyr stared at her hands after the nurse left, trying to understand how the same country dropping bombs on Hamburg could also make sure her boots didn't blister her feet. The contradiction created a pressure inside her chest that she had no vocabulary for. At 6:46 p.m., a bell rang outside. Not an alarm, not a summons. It signaled mail hour. A guard opened a wooden chest containing note paper, envelopes, and sharpened pencils. The women approached slowly, uncertain if this was a privilege or a test. The guard handed each woman 2 sheets of paper and 1 envelope. They were told they could write home once processing finished. 2 women broke down, clutching the stationery to their chests. They hadn't written home in weeks. German military logistics had collapsed so thoroughly that letters no longer traveled, except by luck. America, in contrast, processed prisoner mail with factory-like reliability. 1,000 outgoing letters per week from this camp alone. The idea that their voices could reach home again felt like stolen light. At 6:51 p.m., the heaters along the wall clicked louder as they cycled. Warm air spread across the room, filling every corner with a steady, regulated heat. German shelters had gone cold by 43. Coal shortages bombed rail lines. Factories reassigned to rocket production. Civilian heat became a memory. The German women felt the warmth rise through the bunk frames into their backs. Several inhaled sharply, startled by the sensation. Warmth in wartime provided by the enemy. The shock was not physical, it was emotional. Heat meant survival. Survival was something they had stopped planning for. At 6:56 p.m., a whisper ran through the barracks. Not fear, recognition. The recognition that their expectations had been wrong at every level. Every narrative they had carried across the Atlantic had cracked. They had been told Americans were decadent, weak-willed, incapable of discipline. Instead, they found schedules tighter than anything in the Wehrmacht, hygiene stricter than any field hospital, medical infrastructure larger than some civilian cities. They had been taught America was soft. Instead, they found the kind of strength that required no shouting, no threats, no theatrics, just systems, power expressed through order. At 7:02 p.m., Anna began to cry into her hands. Not from humiliation, from the absence of humiliation. She had been bracing for violation all day. Her shoulders had locked, her breath shortened, her stomach twisted, all preparing for a pain that never came. When she realized it was truly over, the sobs ripped out of her in quiet waves. Another prisoner sat beside her, unsure what to do, because no one had prepared them for the emotional collapse that followed relief. Fear is heavy. When it lifts, it does not drift upward. It breaks. At 7:08 p.m., 3 women compared their reactions in hushed tones. One said she still expected the cruelty to come tomorrow. Another believed the Americans were softening them before interrogation. But a third woman, Ruth, whispered something different. Maybe this is simply how they do things. The moment she said it, the others felt silent. The idea had the weight of truth, not kindness, not sympathy, just a system functioning far beyond anything Germany could replicate by mid. At 7:14 p.m., the nurse returned with a tray of ointments and bandages. She treated cracked knuckles, small burns, infected cuts. Nothing dramatic, nothing invasive. But each touch chipped away at the psychological armor the German women had built to survive. They had learned to tense at every approaching hand. Now, they fought the urge to lean into those same hands for reassurance. War had taught them that gentleness was dangerous because it was always temporary. Tonight it did not feel temporary. At 7:18 p.m., the guard performed final count. The women held still, expecting the tone to shift back into cold command. It did not. The count was quick, unceremonious, routine. A guard closed the door gently, not slamming it. The lights dimmed again, gradually, not abruptly. Every action communicated stability rather than dominance. That was the moment the psychological break completed itself. They realized the Americans didn't need fear to control them. They already had something stronger: capacity. At 7:23 p.m., one woman whispered into the dark, "They don't want to hurt us." The silence that followed was not disbelief. It was acceptance. Slow, painful acceptance. The kind that comes only when fear has been disproven repeatedly, meticulously, through actions so consistent they cannot be misinterpreted. By 7:27 p.m., the barracks had fallen quiet except for soft breathing and the hum of the heater. The women lay awake staring at the faint outline of the rafters above them, asking the same question in their own minds. What kind of country fights a world war, and still has enough left over to treat its enemies like patients instead of prisoners? If you believe the collapse of fear can reshape a person more than any weapon, comment power. If you disagree, tap like and subscribe to follow the next chapter of this story. At 7:31 p.m., the barracks settled into the kind of stillness that only comes after shock, not exhaustion. A thin line of moonlight slipped through the window frames, casting pale silver across the bunks. The women were not asleep. None of them could be. Their bodies rested, but their minds churned. Everything they had expected when the truck stopped at 4:20 p.m. humiliation, exposure, punishment had been replaced by a sequence of events so orderly, so controlled, so strangely humane, that they no longer knew where to place their fear. Fear, with no place to go, simply dissolves, and what remained in its absence was something quieter, heavier: reckoning. At 7:35 p.m., Martyr sat up. Her silhouette rose slowly, hands clasped around the blanket issued barely an hour earlier. She whispered into the dark that she had been wrong about everything. Not about the war, not about politics or loyalties or the devastation Germany had unleashed across Europe. She meant something far more personal. She had been wrong about her captives, wrong about the enemy, wrong about the idea that cruelty was a universal rule of war. The realization made her chest tighten, not out of pain, out of recognition. She had never once imagined a world where procedure could feel like mercy. At 7:39 p.m., Hilda turned over and stared at the ceiling. She thought of the day her unit retreated across the French countryside, scavenging for scraps of bread, sleeping in farm sheds, losing hope 1 inch at a time. She remembered the cold that clawed through her coat, the hunger that made her joints ache. Tonight, she lay under a blanket thick enough to trap heat even with the windows open. Heat in wartime, hygiene in wartime, quiet in wartime, and all given to prisoners. She whispered that America had not defeated Germany with bullets alone. They had defeated them with something far more impossible to fight: excess. At 7:43 p.m., one woman, Anna, began to write on the notepaper she had received earlier. She wrote slowly, uncertain whether she was allowed to form the words that came next. I am alive. I'm treated well. Do not fear for me. She paused, the pencil trembling in her hand. She had written letters under British Guard before, short and censored. None had felt like this. None had been shaped by dignity. She folded the paper carefully, as though afraid it would disintegrate under the weight of the truth it carried. At 7:46 p.m., the heaters cycled again. The warm air drifted across the room like a soft exhale, and for the first time since capture, the women allowed their shoulders to unclench fully. In the darkness, a quiet thought moved from bunk to bunk, unspoken but shared. If the enemy treats us this way, what does that say about the world we were taught to fear? At 7:51 p.m., the sounds of the camp faded into night-distant boots on gravel, a door closing, the hum of the generator feeding power to a compound built with industrial confidence Germany no longer possessed. The women finally lay back, allowing their bodies to sink into mattresses designed for comfort, not punishment. At 7:55 p.m., Ruth whispered the words that none of them had dared speak aloud. They won because they could afford to be merciful. The others did not answer, but they did not need to. Every blanket, every hot shower, every cotton gown, every gentle instruction had delivered the same lesson. America won not by bullets, but by production, abundance, and mercy. If you believe this story deserves to be carried forward to the next generation, comment for. If not, tap like and subscribe to ensure these forgotten histories are never lost.